Good afternoon. Welcome to the LSE and welcome to the European Institute. This event, which is Nationalism and War in the 21st Century Europe, is co-hosted by the European Institute together with the annual the Journal of Common Market Studies, which is under the umbrella of University Association of Contemporary University Studies. This is annual lecture of the Journal for Common Market Studies. I am Vesna Popovsky, and I'm a fellow here in conflict and post-conflict studies at the European Institute. I'm very pleased to be joined by a speaker and by discussants. And thank you very much to all of you for coming. I just have to tell you house rules. Please, can you switch your mobile phones off? We are going to have this, hopefully, we are hoping that it's going to be a podcast if there are no any technical glitches, which we cannot know about in advance. And if anyone would like to tweet, this event is LSEEI on Twitter. So let us start just with a few words before I introduce the speakers. We live these days in a polarized and in a fragmented world, which has been turbulent around a few decades, at least here in Europe, in the rest of the world, much more. There is a rise of anti-immigrant and populist movements, the erosion of traditional political parties, and the widening of socioeconomic inequalities, which had profound effect on what is going on in Europe. But also we have to think about, and we'll be thinking about the rest of the world. Therefore, these events are challenging thinking and approaches to what is going on. In this lecture, Siniša Malešević is going to critically examine the conventional wisdom that nationalism and war are the relics of the past in Europe, primarily he is going to discuss. Drawing on longue durée sociological perspective, he will argue that these forces remain deeply embedded in modernity. Rather than anomalies, the resurgence of nationalism and organized violence should be understood as in a broader historical patterns shaping contemporary Europe. The lecture will be, as usual, followed by questions and answers, and that is going to be the opportunity for you to raise quite a few questions in relation to what Siniša Malešević is going to say, as well as our discussant. So now let me tell you a few words about our discussants. Siniša Malešević is a full professor of comparative historical sociology at University College Dublin. Previously, he had research and teaching appointment at the Institute for International Relations at Zagreb, at the Center for Study of Nationalism in Prague, where he worked with Ernest Gellner, and after that at the University of Galway. Professor Malešević's main research interests include the study of war and violence, his last book, which I'm sure some of you have seen, ethnicity, nation states and nationalism, empires, ideology, sociological theory, and comparative historical sociology. Jasna Dragović-Soso is a visiting professor here at LSEE, which is research on Southeast Europe, and Hellenic Observatory Center, which is a research on contemporary Greece and Cyprus. She has written extensively about memory politics, transitional justice, nationalism, state disintegration, and international intervention, with a focus on former Yugoslavia and the post-Yugoslav region. Maya Tudor is a professor of politics and public policy at Blavatnik School of Government and fellow of St. Hilda's University of Oxford. Her research investigates the origins of effective and democratic states with a regional focus on South Asia. She has also written extensively on nationalism. Before embarking on an academic career, Maya worked as a special assistant to chief economist of the World Bank, Joseph Stiglitz, at UNICEF, at the US Senate and Bangladesh Rural Advancement Committee. And then we have here Gianfranco Baldini, who is associate professor in political and social sciences at the University of Bologna. His research concentrates on Western European political and electoral system, European Union, regionalism, and federation processes. But he's here in a role of a co-editor of the annual review of the Journal of Common Market Studies. And as I said, this lecture is annual lecture of the journal. Therefore, Gianfranco Baldini will also offer his welcome, and then we'll start with the Sinisha's presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Vesna. I'm just going to take 3 or 4 minutes to thank you also on behalf of Elena Baracani and Sorina Soare, who are my co-editors at the annual review of the Journal of Common Market Studies. And just to explain you what these events will become also in terms of, I don't want to put too much pressure on the author, but usually the annual lecture becomes the opening article of the annual review. And this will be, again, the same this year as last year's. And this annual lecture has been held by prominent scholars on EU affairs, such as Tanya Borzel, Gerda Falkner, Simon Hicks, Eric Jones, Ellen Wallace, and many others that I don't have time to mention specifically. So we decided this year to step out a bit of the traditional EU issues that are actually usually covered in the annual review every year. And our mission has been, since last year when we took over as editors, also to strengthen the interdisciplinary nature of the annual review, which is usually, like to go beyond political science as such, and also to understand Europe in a broad sense. So this is how we came last year to reflect upon the critical question of European borders. This is what Alina Mungio-Pipidi did in Trento during the General UASIS conference. And this year we decided to invite Siniša as an expert who actually covers the 2 topics which give the title of today's lecture. So both nationalism and war. I think I don't need to explain why both issues are relevant, and Siniša is going to do this much better than me. So I won't take more time for this, but I'm just going to quote this time from one of the discussants. So Maya Tudor said in her contribution with Aris Milonas in the annual review of political science that there has been an historical neglect of nationalism in political science, which is just beginning to change, and which arises out of historic and normative grounds. So we thought also that we wanted to give our contribution to reflect more on this issue, which has been, at the core of these universities, if we remember the 1990s and all the work of Anthony Smith and many other scholars. So we decided to ask Siniša, and we were very happy that he accepted our invitation to reflect on these 2 axes of nationalism and war, which, as Vesna already said, have been at the center of his work now for many years. So Siniša has become, a key reference scholar for both camps, for both nationalism and war, and so we are very happy that he has accepted our invitation. And we also thought that what we're going to hear is going to be crucial also in terms of raising arguments and insights in order to avoid 2 issues that we think are quite dangerous. One is the issue of presentism, many scholars that do not take into account the roots of these phenomena, and this is what I think Siniša can explain in a few minutes, and also the pervading threats of fake news. So let me thank again Siniša, the LSE, UASIS, and the chair and the discussant, and I'm sure it's going to be a very inspiring event. Thank you.
Okay, so I hope you can hear me. Yeah, and thanks very much, Gianfranco, and Vesna and everybody else involved in organizing this event. And thank you all for attending. I know there are so many other interesting things to do rather than listening to some really dark lecture. So what I want to do today is to look a little bit at this relationship between nationalism and war, but I will treat them a little bit separately because, as Gianfranco mentioned, much of my work has been on these two topics in a very separate way. So this is also a kind of challenge for me to try to bring them together and zoom in on Europe in particular, although we can talk later on outside of Europe. What these two topics have in common is that there has been a really a kind of dominance of the view that, particularly in European context, there is no room for war. Particularly after the Second World War onwards, there has been this emphasis on geopolitical stability that has characterized Europe, building a European project, and particularly after the collapse of communism, the idea was, there is no place for war, there's no place for violence. At the same time, we could see that nationalism also has been understood as an ideology that generally peaked in 19th century and since then has been in decline.
Microphone.
Maybe I can, yeah, thanks very much. So since a Brexit and things happening in the last 10 years now, we could see that people have started talking about re-emergence of nationalism. And then obviously with wars in Europe, particularly with Ukraine war, then again, what's happening now? Suddenly we have this war in the European continent. So what I want to do is really to look a little bit historically at these two phenomena to see that there's nothing really particularly unusual in this. If you look at the long-term patterns of historical development on the European continent, nationalism and war have been integral to this continent in the way how it's shaped in many different ways. So if you look very briefly, I've analyzed some of these things in my books. The leading scholars, particularly leading sociologists, and I have to be critical of sociologists because I'm a sociologist, tended to write, only a few years ago about nationalism as being kind of relic of 19th century. Leading people like Ulrich Beck and Zygmunt Bauman and Giddens, who was director here, we're talking about post-national age and cosmopolitan world emerging and globalization, individualism, consumerism, replacing the idea of identifying with the nation state. These were very popular topics until quite recently. I was very critical of this, so it's not that I'm now coming with criticism. This is something I wrote about 20 years ago. And we have the same kind of attitude towards organized violence, war in particular. People like Hartmut Rosa, the leading German sociologist, obviously Habermas, we're all focusing on this idea that it's very unlikely that we could see war, large-scale war in Europe, that most wars are now civil wars, new wars taking place outside of Europe, Africa, Asia, elsewhere. So this view, obviously, it lacks historical nuance. It lacks, it is a present-centric attitude. It lacks kind of engagement, looking at the long-term patterns. And if we look at, nationalism, particularly, the tendency has been, particularly in Europe, to see nationalism as a far-right ideology, something to do with anti-migration politics, nativism, kind of generally, as you can see, these images that we associate with ADF and Marie Le Pen and all the kind of the far right. So that was the idea, that these people are nationalists and everybody else is not a nationalist. And when in the context of Brexit and the first Trump administration, we could see these images on the main magazines like The Economist and Foreign Affairs. And as you can see here, the focus is on depicting these representatives of these kind of far-right ideas as being, coming from a 19th century. See the way how they are dressed, with flag waving and singing, some patriotic songs, or we have the, clenched fist there, indicating that this is something that has no place in contemporary world. And the term that dominated since then, so it's again almost 10 years now, was a new nationalism. Idea that nationalism that we had in 19th century is now returning in some shape and form, and that is unusual, unexpected. Why is this happening? However, we have to look a little bit, again, deeper, more historically, to see that, the whole concept of new nationalism is deeply problematic. There is tendency to focus on very few years, maybe a decade or so, and overemphasize these kind of recent developments rather than looking over the course of a longer period, like, few centuries, essentially to understand how nationalism came to be. Even the term new nationalism is deeply problematic. It's a very lazy term, a very kind of vague, and it is something that has been happening all the time in the last 100 years. So this is a book published by Theodore Roosevelt on the basis of his speeches from 1920s called The New Nationalism. In that time, this is almost 100 years ago, the idea was that nationalism is something to do with the welfare state, and it's a good thing. Then in the First World War, again, we see scholars using the term new nationalism to describe what was happening with the collapse of empires like Ottomans and Habsburgs, and they describe this phenomenon as new nationalism. Then we have, in the 1950s, Louis Snyder's book talking about 1950s and 60s decolonial projects in Africa and Asia, referring to them as new nationalism. Then in the 70s, we see Tom Nair's book, The Breakup of Britain, Crisis and New Nationalism, Neo-Nationalism, explaining the rise of Scottish and Welsh nationalism. Then in the 80s, we have books again on new nationalism, dealing with Basque nationalism, Catalan nationalism. Then we have the 1990s, Michael Ignatov, Blood and Belonging, Journeys into New Nationalism, and so on and so forth. There are so many books trying to capture this apparently new phenomenon that appears every 10 years or so, which obviously it's not new, because then it will be new nationalism. So, I mean, I'm just, making a caricature of this to show you how useless this term is, in a sense, because what we are talking about is the same phenomena that keeps changing constantly. So rather than, using this term new, which could imply that there was no nationalism before, and that's what often is aimed, or it's profoundly different from what it was before, which isn't the case. We are really talking about the same phenomenon that obviously has different variations. It's over the course of the last 200, 250 years. So what is also important for us is to understand that nationalism is not something to be associated with far right. This is just one version of nationalism. Nationalism can be a centrist ideology, can be a left-wing ideology. People like I live in Ireland, when the leading opposition party is a left-wing nationalist, Sinn Féin, and here in Wales and Scotland as well, we have a lot of kind of anti-colonial nationalisms all over the world, which are quite left-wing and so on. Nationalism can be liberal, can be conservative, and so on. So we have to talk about nationalism as being a kind of key ideological glue of the world that we inhabit, and that's the world of nation states. So as long as we live in nation states, there will always be nationalism, because there is, nationalism is a backbone of nation state. We legitimize existence of a nation state by invoking people, people representing the state in which they live, which is very different from patrimonial kingdoms or empires or city-states and things like that. So there is no really modern democracy outside of the framework of nation state. And also outside of democracy, and this is something I imagine Maya will be talking about, this link between democracy and nationalism, majority, and all of that. So this is crucial, this is important. And as I mentioned, we have to think about nationalism much more broadly, rather than being confined to specific political spectrum, extreme right or extreme left in some way. It is also a principal mode of collective subjectivity in modern world. I have a new book on this coming out at the end of the world called Nationalism as a Way of Life, where I analyze how we've moved from world of empires into nation states. And I see nationalism as a dominant operative ideology of modern era, social glue that holds members of a society and institutions together. Okay, so the key point here that I'm trying to make is that we have to look at nationalism historically, and we have to see how crucial nationalism is as a form of political legitimacy for the world that we live in. So in a sense, when we end up with the far-right groups and far-right movements, this is not because they suddenly appear out of nowhere because of economic crisis or some cultural clash or, things like that. There are historical reasons why nationalism develops. It becomes integral to the way how social order is constructed. and the way how we form our own subjectivities. So what's also important here, and I mentioned that, is the nation state. So when we talk about nationalism, and assume that nationalism is something to do with 19th century, this is what a lot of historiography has traditionally emphasized, that 1848 revolutions and things like that. But then you have this very simple map here, which shows us that supposedly 19th century or early 20th century, which were the heyday supposedly of nationalism, were not. Essentially, these were the worlds of empires and monarchies, and it took really much of the 20th century that nationalism becomes the dominant ideology. It's not, we can say the 19th century is really beginning of this ideology. Well, the way how nationalism becomes infused in everyday life, and the way how national institutions have been structured, is something that takes place for much longer periods of time. And 20th century here is particularly important, that we often don't think about as having anything to do with nationalism. Again, if you go to 19th century, we see empires like this, the Habsburg Empire, which is a kind of extremely culturally diverse. It is not organized, it's not run in terms of emphasizing ethno-national homogeneity, because it's run according to dynastic principles. It's run according to hierarchies, inborn hierarchies, whether you're aristocrat or not. And you can see this, enormous map, which is also not enough, because most of the diversity were in the cities. If you were to look at the main cities like Vienna and Budapest and Prague, they are extremely internally diverse. It's a very heterogeneous world that, after the Second World, ends up like this. So this is a modern Hungary. And as you can see, it's almost completely monoethnic, Hungarian. So this is a result, obviously, of violence, wars that have taken place. It is a result also of cultural assimilation. And it is something that characterizes very much European development in the last 200 years, moving from very heterogeneous empires in the direction of much more homogeneous nation states. Obviously, this immigration complicates this. We can talk about this later. So the key issue here is that we have to think about nationalism as a sociological phenomenon that underpins our everyday realities. So we are all born in nation states. Everybody expects us to be, we can talk after the, at the reception later on, to introduce everybody to each other. And the second question that you usually ask, so first is, what's your name? The second, where are you from? And the expectation is not that you will say, I'm from this particular village or this clan or this family. You will say, I'm from France or Germany and UK. So that's the way we are very much socialized into this world of nation states. We are raised in educational institutions run by nation states, or approved by, even if it's private schools, by programs have to be approved by nation states. We are employed by nation states. Our welfare provisions are secured through nation states, and so on and so forth. So we end up with this idea, that national identity is something that matters to us, and it obviously does matter to millions of people, billions of people. But rather than thinking about this as a personal thing, as a personal choice that often, you ask a 13-year-old kid, do you feel really proud to be Italian or French? And he could say, yeah, I'm very proud. This is my feeling. This is who I am. But this is really less of a personal choice, and it's a reflection on the world into which this particular teenager was born. So it is a reflection of organizational ideological realities. If he were born in 13th century, he wouldn't identify like that. He would identify, obviously, with his village or clan or family and things like that. Okay, so in that sense, nationalism is integral to our world. But what's also important to us to understand that nationalism is not necessarily violent. If it was violent, it wouldn't be so powerful. It wouldn't be so omnipotent. It wouldn't be integral to everyday life. So nationalism is only violent in particular moments in time. And also organized violence is not necessarily nationalist. We know wars, obviously, have been fought for thousands of years before nation states emerged. Nation states have been around for a very short period of time, and human beings have fought wars for so many different reasons. So what we see with nationalism is that once it starts to rise from 19th century onwards, not only as a political phenomenon, but economic and cultural and social and in everyday life micro interaction. We end up with this. We end up with there are many surveys. This is just one snapshot of surveys all over the world, and what we see is that majority of people on this planet identify very strongly with their nation states. So this is just like one snapshot, and if you look at the Eurobarometer surveys in the last 50 years, we can see constant increase despite the European Union, and people do find, okay, maybe not in this country, European Union, but let's say on the continent, European Union has been seen as important and good in facilitating, exchanges, educational exchanges, and young people's ability to work elsewhere. But you will always find, even within these Eurobarometer surveys, that attachment to nation keeps increasing. It's okay, can fluctuate a little bit here and there, but from the 60s onwards, it's constantly up and up. And here you can see, for the rest of the world, these greens, both greens, are about being very proud in one's nation. You see this, right? So this is again just one snapshot, and there are many surveys which indicate how powerful nationalism has become. How embedded in everyday life it is, and we think about ourselves as being primarily members of specific nation states. So what I do, and I won't bother you much with this, I don't have that much time. I analyze this whole process, how we've come to where we are, to this idea of grounding. So I have this book called Grounded Nationalisms, the second one here, where I develop this in details and look at specific case studies, although these two other books also deal to some extent with some of these ideas. So what I'm trying to say is that nationalism is a historical phenomenon which has expanded through grounding. Grounding is an ongoing process. It can kind of started with kind of expanding vertically, within different social groups. So it was essentially a middle class phenomenon in 19th century, which supposedly was the peak, was just the beginning of this process. And then, it penetrated different social strata. So it's really in the early 20th century that we see majority of people in Europe start identifying in national terms rather than religious or local, regional, and so on. And then horizontally, nationalism becoming a global phenomenon. This is particularly something that starts from after the Second World War. When we see nation state replacing idea of empire and patrimonial kingdoms and city-states, and even city-states like Singapore or Monaco reframe themselves as a nation states, to have their presence and visibility in the world of nation states. I talk also about how nationalism becomes organizationally grounded through specific means, organizational means. So you need, initially revolutionary societies, social movements, but ultimately it's really the state. Once nationalism captures the state, you have means at your disposal: transport, communication networks, judiciary, military police, and so on and so forth. I talk also about ideological grounding, how nationalism replaced the imperial mindsets, imperial worldview by invoking these grand vistas of collective liberation, emancipation, belonging, and also offering justification and legitimacy for the idea of popular sovereignty and so on. And then what's also important, particularly for sociologists, is the micro-interactional grounding. So this is the way how nationalism kind of penetrates everyday life, in our kind of more intimate settings, so families, friends, neighbors, lovers. A lot of research in sociology of everyday life is focused on this kind of everyday reproduction of nationalism. But what's also important is the emotional aspect of it, the emotional attachments. That we can talk about this later if necessary. Okay, so that's nationalism, and I hope it's clear what I'm trying to argue, why nationalism is important and why it is expanding, why it's powerful. But what's also important is to look at the role of organized violence and war in particular, and see how it links with nationalism. So for a number of years, we had this view, quite popular, that organized violence has been in decline. Pinker's books have been quite popular since 2011 onwards, but other people like Joshua Goldstein and John Miller and Azar Gat have popularized this idea that violence has been declining over the course of human history, emphasizing economic interdependence, international cooperation, attitudes to war have changed, that we don't like war. And Pinker is sort of misrepresenting Elias as a project of civilizing process and talks about humanitarian revolutions and importance of so-called gentle commerce, which is rootless capitalism in translation. And, you know, a lot of this research has been debunked by historians from very different periods. I won't go into details. But the key issue really here is this was, again, reflection on a particular moment in time, rather than looking at a long-term historical change. And a lot of this is based on very dubious and problematic data. I won't go again into details. I largely deal with this question in The Rise of Organized Brutality, where I developed the opposite argument that organized violence, the capacity for organized violence has been increasing constantly over the course of human history, particularly in the last 200 years. And these other books, you know, kind of deal with different aspects of violence. So what I want just to kind of focus a little bit on Europe, because Europe is really the good example for this, because we see Europe as being a particularly peaceful continent, especially since 1945. And then suddenly we have this major war, you know, Ukraine war, that has transformed everything. It has transformed how we see this continent, how we understand the long-term, you know, trajectories of social change. And we can see now that violence has been expanding, you know, very in front of our eyes, you know, with the Syrian war, you know, with, you know, many wars, Congo and Myanmar, and, you know, obviously Gaza and so on and so forth. And we can see there is, again, even quantitative data points in that direction, that there is a more individual deaths. There's, you know, the number of war refugees is the highest since the records are available, you know, over 122 million people and so on and so forth. But if we zoom in just on Europe, what's interesting here again, and what's important for us to look is at the historical trajectory of this continent. And what, you know, if you look at the history of Europe, what we see is that this is actually a continent that has been an epicenter of war for much of its history. We have these two periods where we had peace, you know, 1850, often is referred to 1815 to 1914 because of the First World War, because people forget the Balkan Wars in 1912 and 13, which had 1 million casualties. So these were, we can talk really about until 1912. But even in this period, European countries were fighting, you know, empires were fighting wars in Asia, in Africa, everywhere. So we couldn't really say that this period was a period of peace. It was a period of peace within Europe, but not outside of Europe. So it's really 1945 to 1991 that we have an unusual period of protracted peace. But even this was happening at the moment when we were fighting Cold War. You know, when, you know, a lot of armaments were built, nuclear power was, you know, reached its you know, kind of apex in some respect. And people like Levy and Thompson give us kind of very long-term view of how wars have transformed. They talk about the arc of war starting from Bronze Age Mesopotamia, over early Iron Age, Eastern Mediterranean, China, and then for much of history, it was really Europe that is the backbone of war. So we have early modern and industrial age Europe, you know, centuries of constant war, you know, until 1945. So what's also important for us, which we forget, is that wars are not only destructive and killing, you know, millions of people, but they have unintended consequences on development. You know, so a lot of research, obviously, you know, Tilly, Mann, and others, and even before then, Gumplowitz and Ratzenhofer and others have emphasized how early modern Europe gained in strength, geopolitical strength, through kind of intensified interstate warfare. So we see that these wars have, you know, destroyed many entities, and Tilly talks about medieval period when you have thousands of different polities, and we end up with 40, you know, states in the early 20th century. So the powerful states were able to kind of destroy or eat up, you know, weaker polities. And what's also important is that these protracted wars have generated also resistance on the part of the civil society. They contributed to the development of civil societies. the rulers were forced to borrow money from bankers and to finance these wars. Also, they stimulated development of science technology in a way for their military purposes, but ultimately they built better roads and transport communication networks. So all of these are consequences of war. Europe has become much more powerful, and having the much more powerful states, also more developed citizenship rights, where rulers had to buy out citizens to get them to answer recruiting calls and pay taxes and things like that. So in that sense, we can see how wars were crucial for European development. The epicenter of this were two total wars of the 20th century, First and Second World War. These were the most destructive conflicts ever fought on this planet, and they were both initiated and led by European states. So in a sense, Europe was at the heart of war. After the Second World War, we see geopolitical stability. We see unprecedented economic prosperity. We see development of welfare state, which in itself is a product of war. We know how first pioneering welfare provisions were started in Prussia, which was the most militaristic state then in the US, very much due to war and a willingness of people to fight in these wars. We also know that despite this stability, this was all happening in the context of Cold War, as I mentioned, and constant preparation for war. We have to remember, this was a world of two, large military blocs, NATO and Warsaw Pact, which were constantly militarizing, constantly arming, constantly at war footing. So what's also important is that we sometimes forget that these two ideological conflicts between the communist and capitalist countries were also happening and contributing to the development of nationalism. So society-wide nationalist projects, particularly in everyday life, the increase of education levels, the full literacy, the transport and communication networks that were built to reach every part of specific nation states, all of these things were happening during the Cold War, mostly in European context, and during the also period of heavy armament. After the collapse of Soviet Union, we see a period of disarmament in Europe, kind of shifting in the direction of more professional armies, smaller armies, so lower levels of mobilization. A lot of countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, have abandoned conscription, and we see no direct threat to European security. But we also see new waves of war. The largest were the Yugoslav wars of secession, 91 to 95. Then we see the first Nagorno-Karabakh war, then Georgian Civil War, and Kosovo War as the end, where the NATO was directly involved with bombing. So even in that period of stability, we see a rise of organized capacity for violence, and we see continuous rise of nationalism as well. Now, if we look at the 21st century, we see really continuity in building military capacities. We see continuity in building nationalist infrastructures. So we see a number of wars, Georgian-Russian War 2008. We see recently Azerbaijan taking over the Nagorno-Karabakh completely and threatening further. We see Russian occupation of Crimea, and then we see this huge war between the two territorial largest states on this continent, Ukraine and Russia, which has generated enormous casualties and millions of refugees. But what's also important, it has changed the character of European geopolitics completely. We've shifted away from this idea that professional armies can defend us, that we don't need to invest much in military budgets. So a lot of European states are now rearming extensively, thinking about introducing conscription. Some have reintroduced conscription, devoting enormous amounts of technology, science to armaments. And this has initially was for Ukraine, but ultimately it's for one's own protection. So Poland, Germany, particularly UK as well, are now having enormous military budgets at planning and so on. This war in Ukraine that we all know about a lot now has been really unprecedented in some respects, but it has also a part of the long-term trends that we've witnessed on this continent, with huge number of casualties, with millions of internally displaced people and refugees in neighboring states. What's also interesting in the way, although we don't really know, the accurate figure for military casualties, so these are the ones that have been floating, about 165 Russian and about 100,000 Ukrainian military casualties, but they're much larger than that. Some people are talking about million. And we will not know this until the end of the war, probably. What we do know is that there is a constant building of powerful armies. On both of these sides. We are talking about millions of people being armed. And why is this important? It's important because once you build a huge military, it's very difficult to demilitarize. And we know from history, again, once you militarize society, its dominant values change, in a sense. So if we have a very powerful militarized Poland, very militarized Germany tomorrow, that will have impact, for the rest of the continent and the rest of the world. We also know a little bit about, ethno-national dynamics within this war, with minorities being particularly overrepresented in recruitment on Russian side, and in terms of casualties, like small groups like Churches and Buryats and so on and so forth. What's also interesting is how quickly states can transform their economies. You build a war economy in a matter of months, ultimately. Here we see how, in a short period of time, Ukraine military budget has it was 62 million in 2014 before the invasion of Crimea. And then in 23 was already 30.8 billion. So states can do that. They can convert everything into military, and economy becomes war economy. And 50% of government expenditures already in 22 went to the military, with enormous number of arms producers. So again, once you have arms producers, you have this economy, military economy, that after the war will continue producing armaments and selling them somewhere else. And we have a lot of people working in these industries. Okay, and I'll just kind of end with focusing a little bit on this relationship between war and nationalism in the context of this particular war, because this war has it shapes our present, it shapes kind of 21st century Europe, and what we see is that war has had direct impact on both nationalisms, on Russian and Ukrainian. They have increased. Ukrainian nationalism is obviously associated with a kind of more defensive nationalism that emerges in the context of being attacked, and the social cohesion increases. So we know that from Zimmel and onwards. But there are tensions within Ukrainian nationalism, enormous tensions with what kind of nationalism is emerging there, what will eventually transpire after the war. So between the more civic, more liberal versions of more moderate gradualist, and the kind of more conservative, more ethnic, more right-wing nationalisms that are present as well. So we have a tension here quite present, and this is not unusual. It has always happens in times of war. We also know that the sense of national identification has dramatically transformed, and war had played a crucial role in this. In 2000, 72.7% of people in Ukraine identify as Ukrainians and 20% as Russian. Now, in the latest survey, as you can see, overwhelming majority of people identify as Ukrainian, obviously, which is not unusual when you're fighting, Russian side. So it's not something we will see what happens after the war. What's also important is the intensity of national identification has increased, again, as a result of war. And we, before the Russian invasion of Crimea, Ukraine was very kind of national identity was very uneven, underdeveloped in many respects, and war has changed that. Now people identify, you see 91% of citizens express this attitude of being proud of being Ukrainian, which before it was only 68%. Russian nationalism has also changed, so it is kind of built on a mix of ethno-nationalist rhetoric, neo-imperial idea, and also a reference to Soviet nostalgia. There's a lot of this Soviet revival in Russia, glorifying Stalin and as a empire builder and things like that. But even if you look at the way how Putin justified his invasion in 22, you see that it is very much a nationalist language used. The purpose of this operation is to protect people who for 8 years now have been facing humiliation and genocide perpetuated by the Kiev regime and so on and so forth. So in a sense, the logic behind this addressing his own population is, we are protecting our people living there abroad. So it is a nationalist logic that has been deployed. Okay, so I'll just finish now. What's important for us to understand is that this continent has been really shaped by nationalism and organized violence. Organized violence for centuries, nationalism for about 200 years or so. But nationalism and war are not necessarily, mutually, independent. They can be, but often most of the nationalism is not violent. So the key issue for any policy-oriented people is to make nationalism less violent, but make it more civic, make it in a sense more everyday, more banal in a big sense. And the key issue is really to keep organized violence under state control. So it's only under specific geopolitical conditions that nationalism blends with war. And we can see that in times of war, particularly in the world of nation states, it is almost inevitable once war starts that nationalism is used there to radicalize, to mobilize people. Nationalism can do both, can justify offensive and defensive wars. So we can see Ukraine and Russia both using nationalism to justify war, but in a different way, for different reasons. And to mobilize people is not easy. You constantly need to provide, people get tired of war, of death. So it is necessary to use all these institutional mechanisms, ideological mechanisms, war propaganda to keep people on board. So what's important for us is that the conditions for organized violence have been constantly increasing. I didn't talk much about details here, but we can talk about later. So both nationalism and the conditions for organized violence have been developing over the last 200 years. So at some point they can escalate. This has been happening now, but that's obviously not inevitable. So it's not. I don't want to end up on a very dark note. It's not inevitable that they will completely merge. Okay, I'll stop here now. I probably used up my time, and then we can move to discussions.
Thank you very much, Philip. And you were well on time, which is much appreciated. So now we are going to have two discussants, which are going to comment on Sinisha's presentation, but also weaving it in with their own research. Maya.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yeah, there is a microphone if they.
I think you can hear me. I hear people nodding at the back. No?
No.
No. Go for the podcast, right? How is this? Better. All right. Well, that was so wide. First of all, just thank you for inviting me. It's really an honor to be here and to finally meet in person, such a giant in the field of nationalism studies. So because you covered so much ground, I just want to go back and summarize what I think are the key messages. And I want to focus on 3 of the talk that you gave. So the first is nationalism isn't new, right? We have all this work out here. The Economist, the Foreign Affairs covers it, says it's new. And then one of the things you're reminding us is that nationalism has been around for at least 250 years. Some historians would say more, and that it's a variation on the theme. It's the same tune in a different key, so to speak. The second message is that nationalism has certain particularities that we should be aware of. And I'm going to go through a couple of those because I'm going to pick up on a couple of these in my comments. So first is that it obliterates difference. There's a radical equality among citizens that is at the heart of nationalism, and that's an important characteristic of it. Second, that it's both subjective and ubiquitous. So it's in some ways open to interpretation, but all of us are members of nation states and sometimes multiple. Third is that it's an incredibly important source of cohesion. I think it was John Stuart Mill who said there are only two social forces that can cause large groups to walk in solidarity. One of them is religion, and the other one is nationalism. And you're reminding us here, I think, of how important the cohesion aspect is of nationalism. And I think that's also the note that you ended on to some degree. And I think it's an important reminder because nationalism is, of course, so often the source of sacrifice, even in wars, but also not in times of wars. Why do we pay taxes? Why do we volunteer for national services and such like? Those are forms of sacrifice for the nation. Fourth is that it's associated with the state. It inevitably legitimates the use of state power. And so all nations are either in the service of creating, legitimating, or challenging states, right? And the final one is that it's not associated necessarily with the left or the right, right? You can have nationalisms of the left and the right. So that's the second point, that it has these particularities. And the third point that I think you really brought out for us is that wars were once and continue to be today crucial for European development, for the development of European states. Okay, so you've just heard that, I'm not going to belabor that, but I just wanted to highlight these were key points because I'm going to pick up on those points and provide you with three provocations that respond to those, I think, three messages. Because if we all agreed and didn't have anything interesting to say, why come together? So the first, and there are three questions I'm going to pose to you. And the first question is there not something, in fact, distinctively new about the contemporary waves of nationalism that are sweeping the globe? So yes, I take the point that nationalism itself is not new. But I think what, a kind of steel manning of the arguments about nationalism being new today is that there is something distinctive about the nationalisms that are sweeping across the globe today. And I think the strongest form of that argument would be that nationalisms, for most of those 250 years, bound together the common man with a member of the elite. So, when we think about the nobility in Tolstoy's War and Peace, they spoke French, they weren't really part, and so we didn't really think of that, but that's something distinctive about the Russian Empire. So when you think about the transformation from empire to nation states, there is a coming together of elites with the people, both in terms of language and in terms of identification. And I do think that there is something that has happened with globalization and with the massive rise of capital flows and people flows that means that groups of people are now once again turning to the nation state in ways that they haven't in the past. So I think two particular challenges, right? So the first is the fundamental promise of globalization was always that capital flows would move in and out, but that the state, and particularly the welfare state in Europe, right, and we're here talking about Europe, would protect those people, that if their jobs were shipped overseas to China or to India, that the state would help them to readjust to the new realities and provide a safety net for them. But of course, what has happened at the same time that we've seen these massive capital flows and globalization of capital is that the welfare state has retrenched. And so the promise of globalization to catch the people who were left behind by globalization hasn't actually been realized. And the second, of course, is that we're seeing unprecedented rise in global migration flows. right? So since 1990, I think I saw that global migrants have doubled. The sheer number of global migrants have doubled. And that means that our societies are a lot more diverse. And that at a time when people are both more economically at risk, it provides also challenges to culture, right? So I guess the question again I'm posing is there something new and distinctive? So that's the first question. The second question is, and it comes back to the point that you said, well, you know, you have nationalism to the left and nationalism to the right. There's nothing uniquely right-leaning about nationalism, because even though that's what we think about, particularly in Europe, we associate nationalism with the right. Many outlets do. There's nothing inherent to it. Now I want to ask you if that's really true, and if their political conservatives, especially in Europe, do not have a structural advantage in mobilizing ideas of nation. So here's the logic to why that might be the case. So one of the grandfathers of nationalism studies is Renan, and he gave this famous speech in which he said, "What is a nation?" And I'm going to paraphrase, but he said something like, "A heroic past and glory, that's the social capital upon which all nations are made." All right. Now he says, a heroic past with great men and glory. Right? That's the social capital of nations. Okay, so now the past is always layered. We know that one can take certain figures from the past and not others. But if you think about the heroic men of the past, right, as Renan said, there is a conservative slant to that in the sense that citizens of the past in Europe were at one point only men, and they were only certain kinds of men, right? So as our ideas of citizenship have expanded, our ideas of citizenship maybe have not fully updated. So maybe conservatives, who are after all harking back to ideas of keeping things the same and not changing too much, maybe they do have a structural advantage when it comes to mobilizing nationalism, because they have a broader repertoire of people and ideas that have been at the core of belonging, especially in European nations. That's the second question. The third question, and this is sort of a more maybe a little bit, you know, political science, technical question of, do we need to revisit the idea that war made the state and the state made war? So one of the canonical ideas in political science, I am very guilty of this myself, I teach this in I teach my core politics of policymaking class, is that, you know, nations emerge in Europe, and they emerge in Europe because of the Tilly argument that war made the state. And the idea is that you have lots of these little states, and the states, the core logic is the states that are really good at fighting wars absorb and conquer those states. There's a kind of natural selection. And that's certainly true. But I think both on scholarly grounds and on grounds that you yourself end on, I think we have reasons to think, to not focus so much on wars as making states and crucial to state capacity. So on scholarly grounds, Anna Grismale-Busse at Stanford has recently written about a book, or I think it's an article, maybe a forthcoming book, called Tilly Goes to Church. And one of the things, it's a book, yes, okay. But one of the core arguments in there is actually, you know, we're misreading. We're making war too central in our understanding of the nation, because yes, historically it was important, but her argument is, and she shows this really nice graphs, that actually what's going on is that you see that massive consolidation of states in Europe at a time when the Holy Roman Empire collapses. And the Holy Roman Empire had deep political interests in playing states off against one another. So it's not actually war making that makes capacious states, but the collapse of a political actor that wants to fight to use these groups against one another so they don't become too powerful of a force against the, you know. So probably out of time, but
I have 1 more minute.
oh, okay. Excellent. All right. So I think we need to think about also, so I have a couple more things to say, then I can add, we think, for example, and we really anchor on European ideas of nation making, of nation building. But, they don't travel, I think, to the modern day so much. And they don't travel certainly beyond Europe very much. When we think about, Anderson tells us that the printing press and the ability to print the Gutenberg Bible is what makes nations, right? Because all of a sudden you can print books cheaply and in vernacular languages, and all of a sudden there are groups of people who never meet each other, but imagine themselves as belonging to nation. But nations spread all over the world. In the parts of the world that I work on, there is no mass literacy, and yet nations emerge. So I think we need to complexify these ideas that nations emerge through war, because I think a new and I think really interesting research agenda would be to think about, and this is the point that you think you really ended on, how wars change nations, not states, but nations. So you cited that really interesting, those stats about how Ukrainian national identity is changing. And I suspect, right, that going forth, Russian speakers will not be central to the Ukrainian national imagination. So, and that's a way that this war between Ukraine and Russia, or between Europe and Russia, depending on how you look at it, is actually changing not the state. Yes, it's militarizing it. And yes, that's hard to change. But I think more important than that is that it's actually changing Ukrainians' idea of what the nation is. And I'll
Thank you,
stop
Maya. Jasna Dragović also.
Yep, so thanks very much, Vesna, and thank you to Gianfranco, the Journal of Common Market Studies, LSE. I'm really pleased to be on this panel and to have a chance to say a few words in response to Sinisha's lecture. And I too will start with this connection between nationalism and war, which was, after all, the theme. And of course, I'm very sympathetic to your argument about the kind of presentism, about the new nationalism, and this constant resuscitation of a new nationalism over time, and that in fact we're looking at much more sort of long-term trends and trajectories. But I will try and perhaps again push it back a little bit on this, not because I'm a presentist, I'm not, but because I would like to probe a little bit on this connection between nationalism and war, but not in the way that you presented it, which is the impact of war on states, or as Maya mentioned, on nations, but to look at it the other way around. In other words, does nationalism contribute to war? And if so, how do we think about that? And so that's where my sort of contribution, I think, to the debate will lie, and perhaps you can respond to that. And I think my first point would be that perhaps we need to revisit the sort of instrumentalist idea that nationalism merely serves as a type of legitimation or justification for war. In other words, a kind of fig leaf for warmongering leaders who seek to maximize their own power and so resort to war. Rather, what I would like to propose, and it's really a kind of a proposal, I'm not fully sure about this, but let's give it a go. What I would like to propose is that nationalism can actually contribute to producing the ideological basis for the rise of these leaders, and that when certain kinds of nationalism become prevalent in a society, they make war not just possible and envisageable, but actually make it increase in probability. So I think this points us, first of all, to this malleability of nationalism as an ideology, which I think you have tackled. And I'm not referring here to the sort of binary logic of like the civic versus the ethnic nationalism, and one being progressive and good and patriotism, and the other being nasty and horrible and leading to war, war crimes and ethnic cleansing. And I think obviously, as we all know, I mean, all polities, have a continuum and have a combination of both of these elements. But rather, what I would like to focus on is the type of nationalism that has arguably become progressively dominant over the course of the 20th century, and which has kind of reached a certain apogee in the present time, which is victimhood nationalism. And victimhood nationalism is, of course, not new either. But arguably, I think over the last few decades, it has become linked to liberalism specifically. Now, I don't have time to really go into this, but in a nutshell, I mean, there are scholars who have written about this, Samuel Moyn, Lea David, Sarah Gensberger, Sandrine Lefranc, Valentina Pisanti, I mean, Jessie Barton-Hrneshova, who's here in the audience, and others who have shown that since the 1970s, the rise of human rights and which is, of course, became a sort of a hegemonic discourse after the end of the Cold War, and the concurrent sort of memory boom, transnational memory boom with the Holocaust memory at its core, have foregrounded the idea of the victim as a key trope and a principal claim for status and legitimacy in the international system. And of course, this has deeper roots going back to memorialization of the dead from the First World War, Jay Winter and John Gillis kind of work. But as the progressive rise of victimhood as a transnational meta-narrative gained ground at the end of the 20th century, one outcome of this was the spread of victimhood nationalism. In other words, the attachment of nationalist claims to sovereignty over territory being linked to status of the victim. And victimhood nationalism, of course, despite being ideologically embedded in the rise of liberalism and human rights, has then become a key factor in creating circumstances of war and, in extreme cases, also of mass atrocity crimes. And what I think is also striking is the extent to which this nationalism is couched in a liberal discourse of human rights, of civic rights, of minority rights, etc., all the way to the idea of the right to territory as the only form of self-defense for the existential protection of the nation. And this brings me then to my second point, which is perhaps that there is something to be gained by looking at nationalism as a process. In other words, ideologically grounded in the way that Siniša has shown, but not always operating on the same kind of register or level of intensity. Namely, what I would like to propose is that nationalism can intensify progressively in certain conditions, adopting characteristics that can then lend themselves to a policy of war, and indeed can even lead to the idea that war is the only option. And very briefly, I think I would propose that if we look at nationalism as a process, we can also observe that it is inherently interactive and relational, rather than existing in isolation. In other words, nationalist discourses of the kind that I'm describing become progressively shriller and more extreme, as well as gaining wider popular purchase in their interaction with other nationalist discourses, however that other is defined in a specific place or time. And of course, I looked at this when I was examining the rise of Serbian nationalism in the 1980s, leading eventually to the outcomes that we know, the rise of Slobodan Milošević, and eventually a policy of war. But I think that this kind of interactive escalation is equally evident today, both in the post-Yugoslav region and also in other parts of the world. And this brings me then to the final point, which is that over the last decade, memory scholars have been paying greater attention to observing that physical wars are often preceded by what they call memory wars. In other words, wars that take place initially on a discursive level, which focus on and seek to right alleged historical wrongs, whether these are imagined or sometimes indeed very real, wrongs that have been perpetuated in the past by others, who have, however defined others, ethnic groups, states, the West, whatever they are, against us. And when such claims are linked to current grievances and depicted in existential terms, in other words, when they become linked to the notion of ontological security, the ground is then discursively laid for physical war. So my concluding thought would be that when analyzing the relationship between nationalism and war in the 21st century, we need to pay attention to this sometimes slow and undramatic process of escalation in what the historian Carol Gluck has called the vernacular sphere. In other words, made up of the various sub-state and transnational actors operating in the public domain, as well as in the media and in our age, of course, in the digital sphere. And the interactions that initially take place away from the state, but that can, in the right circumstances, become a resource for political actors who are able to tap into these trends and indeed sometimes become hostage to them and basically embark on a path that ultimately leads to war.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Siniša, to Maya, and to Jasna. And now it's your turn. Questions which you would like to ask Siniša or Maya or Denisa. Okay.
Denisa.
Sorry. Okay, we have two hands up. Sorry, Jasna.
You've been hanging out with Denise too much.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much, Jessie Barton-Hronešová. Thanks so much for the presentations. And I have two really quick questions. The first one is to Siniša. You mentioned liberal nationalism. Is that potentially an oxymoron if we start thinking about liberalism as, espousing kind of pluralist worldviews and nationalism as espousing nation state as the only ideology as you presented? So that would be my first question. Could we see that as could you expand a little bit more on what you actually mean on liberal nationalism? And the second question about the novelty of nationalism in the 21st century. When I think about what is really new about the 21st century, I start thinking about what Jasna kind of ended upon, which is the informational sphere. And we start talking about soundbite nationalisms and, how everyday nationalism has been completely transformed, how the process of experiencing nationalism is different on social media. So what is the role of this completely changed and transformed and accelerating informational sphere, and what effect that has on the novelty maybe of the types of nationalisms that we're experiencing today?
Thank you. And then we have a person over there. Just to say, Jessie is at UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies. And
hi, good evening. Koen Slootmakers at City St. George University of London. Thank you for this very fascinating talk, Siniša, and for the comments. My question is perhaps slightly a bigger question, but it kind of picks on some of Jasna's comments. And throughout all of this, I've been thinking, Siniša, what is your idea of violence? How do you actually conceptualize violence? Because your statement of saying nationalism is not always violent, to me, sits somewhere slightly off, in the sense that it depends on where you look for violence and what your definition of violence is. Because perhaps it doesn't always have to be violent outwardly or very physically violent, but nationalism inherently is about borders, and borders are about violence. And so the question is, who is suffering of violence? And so my question is, if nationalism is so able to kind of mobilize at any given point following the memory wars that Jasna talks about, violence already must be present. They can't get it from nowhere. It has to be already present. So where is the normalization of violence happening? How do we actually see the othering and the violence that we have every day that we no longer see as violence, that we have accepted to be normal? And so my question then is nationalism always violent? but it just depends how and when it mobilizes violence and how it hides or activates violence. And then where is the violence located? Is it within the nation or is it located elsewhere in the world?
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Okay. One more question, and then I'll, the lady over there. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Jessie.
Thank you. It was mentioned earlier that nationalism may cross the line into seeing territorial acquisition as the only way to protect its followers. At what point does that cross the line, though, from nationalism to imperialism, where it's no longer about the nation state and the core identity of the movement and goes back to the imperial neo-monarchist expansionism?
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, so there's lots of questions. I mean, two of them have raised so many questions, which I probably will have to answer after.
Yes.
Because they are all very good questions. And so I'll focus on these three. Yeah, Jesse's point about liberal nationalists. Obviously, we do have within the political theory, the whole debate of David Miller and Emil Tamir are making case that, liberal nationalism should be differentiated from conservative and everything else. Here we could see that Maya was talking about nationalism being much more in tune with conservative ideology, and Jasper was saying it has much more to do with liberalism, and I would agree with both of them in a sense, and that's the nature of nationalism. It is very plastic. We have to think historically about it. When nationalism started, conservative thinkers like Edmund Burke they hated nationalism. Nationalism was about French-American Revolution. It's about progress. It's about change. Now we live in a different time when much of nationalism is very right-wing. So we tend to focus on that. If we move back into 60s, where nationalism was very anti-colonial, we would say, oh, this is our friend. I mean, for those of us who are on the left, if I can say so. So nationalism is very flexible. It can be liberal. I don't buy the arguments that Miller and Tamir make that we should be working. I mean, it's interesting, if you look at Tamir's book from 97, which is pure kind of much more more subtle argument, and the new book, which I found very disturbing. In a sense, it's a kind of, the way what she thinks by liberal nationalism doesn't seem to me particularly liberal, much more nationalist, less liberal. Yes, so there are these tensions within nationalism, and as a sociologist, what I'm really interested is, why do we end up with, regardless of which political system you're talking about, on the normative level, like North Korea, like US, like Denmark, they all end up, or Iran, on operative level nationalists. They can be very different nationalists, the democratic, authoritarian, religious, liberal, blah, 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 but we end up always with nationalism. Why is that? This obviously has something to do with the character of modern societies, that this appeals to a lot of people. So nationalism is, in that sense, very flexible. It can go, if you look at it historically. Okay, so the second point about violence, again, if you read my book, The Rise of Organized Brutality, you will see that I have a much more inclusive concept of violence, which is closer to you than might seem, in a sense. So I don't subscribe to kind of narrow concept of violence. Violence is of intentionality and physical brute force. Here, I'm focusing a little more on organized violence, and that's, in a sense, I see all states, they all have coercive capacity. So violence is there somewhere. So this is not necessarily always the case. Any ideology can be violent, regardless, you can, I mean, if you look at Google in 1990s, their websites were all about wonderful world and inclusivity. Look at them now, today, the opposite of that. So in a sense, even consumerist ideologies can be particularly violent. So yes, nationalism can be violent, but again, it's not inherently so, because a lot of nationalism is very banal, very everyday. We reproduce it in a kind of completely, we go and support these national themes if we want to, and we don't necessarily, I mean, some people end up in getting drunk and fighting, but, it can be a ritual to bring people together, drinking beer and watching a game and, family thing and barbecues and blah, blah, blah. So you can say many ideologies have that kind of banal side to it, but the state is important. The state is a coercive power. State is built on monopoly on the legitimate use of violence and can use any ideology for that. So that's So yeah, I operate in a wider concept of violence, yes. The point about nationalism and imperialism is also good. Historically, people were making distinction that, you know, nationalism and imperialism are mutually exclusive ideologies. Obviously, one is to justify empire, the other one is to justify nation state. But now we know, I've edited a special issue, particularly on that question, when we see continuities, you know, so it's not that once nation state come, empires are gone for good. Now we have a number of books who are talking about, you know, very much how about imperial nation states, you know, as a possibility. And what we see in Ukraine, it is both an imperial and nationalist project. So they're not mutually exclusive. And Russia is not unique in that respect, obviously.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
We have 2 more questions to this gentleman.
Very much. My name is Robert Kizik from the Barcelona Institute of International Studies. One of the threads that wove your sort of tying of nationalism and war through time together was number of casualties. And I wonder to what extent, as other people have mentioned in the questions, we need to think about change in that respect in terms of digitization and so forth. And I'm thinking specifically of the work of Mary Kaldor and of Netta Crawford, who've talked about how over time, the way in which the state and warfare were woven together changed to the extent to which the value of the service person was an investment, and specifically the revolutionary and military affairs and how digitization and drones and so forth. So is there a possibility that some of the 21st century elements of war may be different to other parts of other histories of warfare in the past? Because I think that is maybe something that's been glossed over, but I'm sure you've written in your extensive number of books on it.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you so much. To the whole panel, I learned so much about something I fear but know very little about. I was just intrigued by, Javelin outside Leiden University. I was intrigued by one of your comments about how difficult it is to demilitarize once you've militarized, and how that changes the value of society. And that ties into what Yasna was saying about how physical war is preceded by discursive war, perhaps like the demonization and dehumanization of the other. I have the European Union in mind here and the current rush to militarize, but more in general, what do you think are some of the early signs that you see that this is actually happening? Because I assume it's kind of like, it's not a very abrupt, blatant process, but how do we actually recognize when we see this subtle, silent normalization of militarization? Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So yeah. I mean, I think that the point about changing character of war is important. I mean, I'm a person who always emphasizes continuity, which does not necessarily mean that wars don't change. They always change. They have historically changed. Technologies have changed, organizational capacities have changed, ideologies to justify wars have changed. The point is, what do we want to focus on in a sense? So yes, now wars are very much more reliant on AI. We can see what's happening in Ukraine, and also drones, and you don't have to rely so much on manpower. I mean, there is a huge reliance on manpower on battlefields, but you target other infrastructure and blah 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 other things. In Gaza, and particularly, AI is completely present, on a massive way. Yeah, digitalization very important. Also in war propaganda, in terms of social media and everything else. Robotic kind of technologies. I've written a little bit about this. Is something that is also important. A lot of scholars were talking about future wars being fought between robots, but it's much more likely that future wars will be fought between those who can afford robots and humans on the other side. So in a sense, this asymmetry war is likely to increase in that sense that some states have at their disposal much more technological advancement, reliance on AI and digitalization. So that impacts on the character war. But where I differ from Mary Kaldor in a sense, because her focus has mostly been on civil wars, new wars, and now we see a lot of interstate wars. So I've researched more interstate wars than civil wars, and And now, I mean, we see them, everywhere. So that's something that is worth exploring, this Clausewitzian continuity in interstate wars, which perhaps is less visible in civil wars. Yeah, and the second question on militarization, demilitarization. Yes, I mean, I can give you a good example, and Vesna and Jasna know more about the character of, let's say, in Yugoslav was 1990s. Croatia is the only really state who came as a winner. Preserved its territory, gained very high status, and it's become very militarized in every sense. So you ended up with 500,000 people who claim to be, soldiers. They are war veterans. Obviously, if Croatia had an army of that size, it could take over half Europe. So it's everybody. It is obviously something to do with corruption and all that. But the key point here is that because of victorious character of this military, they've gained a high social status and they've influenced politics, for many years. They still do. So these veteran organizations contribute to militarization, continuous militarization of a small country that is Croatia, 3.5 million people or so. So you see that this legacy, particularly of victorious wars, can be very dangerous. It becomes kind of legacy is used constantly in everyday politics. So that could be a danger. I mean, potentially, I'm talking about Ukraine being very militarized. What happens if Ukraine and the war continues with this old military infrastructure? But also, this is something that impacts other European countries. Poland, very, oriented now, militarizing, huge increase in budget. Germany, huge increase in military budget. UK, again, building a lot of weaponry now. Some countries reintroducing conscription, Croatia, Serbia, Poland thinking about it. So yes, we do see this is happening, but militarization is a huge project. It gradually starts. I mean, Sweden is a really lovely example to see. It was a neutral state. There's a lot of debate whether joining NATO or not. Once they join NATO, everything starts. Suddenly there is no problem increasing budget, enormously to what it was before. So that's the way how militarization creeps, in a sense. Big states, like US and China, Russia, they're always militarized. So it's a sort, yeah.
May I just say, we started 5 minutes too late, and I would like to give Siniša a chance to start at least addressing what Maya and Jasna have raised. I hope you agree with that. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions here.
That's why I said,
take a lot of
you
time.
can start.
But I can do some quick points. Yes, I mean, the first point that Maya raised, she's raised many points, but let's say the first one about kind of what is happening actually with nationalism. What is there something new? So my point is not to say there's nothing new. There's always something new. The point is that the saying new nationalism doesn't really explain anything. There's always something new. So yes, I mean, again here, technology does influence things. People do have access to information now that we are talking about and you mentioned the print capitalism and Anderson, which was an argument that worked for that time. It's early mid 20th century. Well, now, as you said rightly, you don't have to be literate in India. There are other ways for you to become nationalized. Mm-hmm. So technology does help that. It bridges this. Most young people don't watch television, don't read newspapers. They, get TikTok information and stuff like that. But this is also nationalized. So in a sense, so what I would argue is that all of these new technologies and new ways have actually created conditions to increase nationalism. There's more nationalism in that sense. And you see a lot of surveys point out that people feel more attached to nations, more proud and all of that. You're right about the impact that globalization had on kind of generating discontent. There are certain promises have been made that didn't happen, and that's. I'm not saying this is wrong. That's something I agree, but I think it's not enough in a sense. So that's why I like to look at the long term, because there are specific factors that feed into a longer narrative of why nationalism went in one way and not the other way. Why it's more right wing now than it was before. So I wouldn't dismiss globalization. In a grounded nationalism, I do make links between that. I think globalization increases nationalism in that sense. Yeah, global migration flows are also element of that, but we do have that in the late 19th century. You know, the so-called first globalization is also, you know, with a lot of people moving from China to Latin America and Europeans moving to North America. And, you know, there are all these charts. I teach course when I have a few lectures on nationalism and globalization, looking historically at data, you know, what was happening. Now, obviously, it's much more than that, but there is more people as well, in a sense. So I wouldn't say that this is something that is profoundly new, but you know, it is bigger. It's a much bigger phenomenon. Yeah, nationalism, right, I did deal with that. I won't go into detail there. The point about war-making states, yes, you're right. There is a lot of criticism. So this is a debate that has been around for many years. I've written about this. Tilly popularized this idea, but this idea has been around from Gumplowitz and Ratzenhofer and other people much earlier. And Tilly has made it more about early modern Europe. But we have Victoria Timborhui applying this to China during the Ottoman warring states period. She argues this has happened in China much earlier than it has in you know, how China became empire ultimately. Then we have Miguel Centeno with Latin America, trying to understand why this didn't happen in Latin America, Middle East. And so I've done this also for the Balkans, trying to say what's missing with Gilly's argument in the early 19th century in Balkans. So yeah, this is an ongoing debate. War is not the only factor. And for me, I prefer to talk about organized violence because there is a variety of things there. And organized violence is also about potential. So it doesn't have to be a war. The fact that, you know, states have monopoly on violation that use violence, but also taxation and education, a few other things, allows them to use that in times of war, but they don't have to. They can make a threat, you know, just the very present. I mean, judicial system is a form of violence, definitely. To go to that point, which is integral to what states are. Yeah. Okay. So that's the. Yeah, liberalism. I did mention briefly. You're right. In a sense, the victimhood narrative is very powerful. It has become much more institutionalized, and it draws on that kind of very much liberal tradition. You know, saying, you know, it is about helping those who have suffered, and then you just embrace that we all have suffered as a nation. So yeah, you're using liberal discourse, but your points might be very conservative, you know, and even, you know, in US, kind of the victim narrative has been used by, you know, kind of very right-wing groups as well. Yes, yeah, I agree. Nationalism is a process. It is about, you know, kind of you need the presence of the other, and you know, there is that competitive element, but there is also this so-called outbidding within the own nationalism. So it's sometimes more radical nationalisms win. And we saw that again in the Yugoslav case in the 90s. There was constantly pushing further, you know, to mobilize people. Yes, I'll stop here now. So.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's been a great pleasure to hear the annual lecture today. I would like to thank Siniša Malešević. I would like to thank the other two speakers, Maja Tjuda and Jasna Dragović-Soso. Thank you for the welcoming words, Gianfranco Baudini. And I hope we'll see you at some other LSE European Institute events. Thank you very much.